I want to congratulate everyone who is here with us. Together, we will continue to move forward the sentence of mediation and community dialogue. And I wish you all a very instructive conference today. And now we'll listen to Baruch. We want to hear what you have to say, Baruch.
Okay. So, can you all hear me? Yeah, good. So,
רגע, just a second, Baruch.
Baruch Sugarman.
1 second, Baruch.
oh, I'm sorry. Too many Baruch.
It's okay. Baruch Sugarman, please.
תודה רבה. אני מאוד מתרגש באמת לפתוח את זה, ואני מאוד מתרגש מהדברים שנאמרו. אני מאוד שמח לברך ביום העיון המקוון הבינלאומי הזה, שאורגן על ידי תוכנית גישורים, יחד עם שותפים רבים, באמת דרך של שותפות, שסייעו בגיוס מיטב אנשי המקצוע בתחום מארצות שונות, ארצות הברית, קנדה, אנגליה, סינגפור, כמובן גם ישראל. To our colleagues abroad, I want to say welcome and shalom from Israel on behalf of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Services. And good morning, good afternoon, and if Singapore has been able to come, as also good evening. Even on the clock, we are spanning the world here. למידה מידע וניסיון בינלאומי הוא חשוב מאוד. לפני יותר מ-15 שנה ערכנו בארץ, שותפים רבים באמת, כנס של ה-World Mediation Forum. במשך 15 שנים האחרונות, הבאנו לארץ לכנסים שנתיים של תוכנית גישורים על הנחיית מפגשים עם אנשי מקצוע מומחים בגישור ודיאלוג מחו"ל. היום בעידן הזום אין תמיד צורך להביא את האנשים אלפי קילומטרים לארץ, ואנו יכולים ללמוד יחד בצורה מקוונת. בשנת הקורונה שעברנו גם למדנו לגשר באופן מקוון, לפתח דיאלוג בכלי הזה של הזום, ולעשות הרבה דברים שקשורים בגישור ודיאלוג קהילתי. הוא איננו תחליף, אני מאמין שהוא איננו תחליף במפגש פנים אל פנים, אך אין ספק שהוא יכול לסייע רבות במצבים שונים, אם נדע להשתמש בו נכון. זה כפי שאמרו יום העיון האחרון שלי כמנהל השירות לעבודה קהילתית במשרד הרווחה והשירותים החברתיים, כאחראי על תוכנית גישורים. תוכנית זאת ואת מרכזי הגישור ודיאלוג בקהילה בארץ פיתחנו וליווינו יחד צוות השירות לעבודה קהילתית ואני, יחד עם מוזאיקה והמרכז הבין תרבותי של ירושלים במשך כ-15 שנים האחרונות. אני מאמין מאוד בתוכנית וביכולת של קהילה להשפיע על יחסים בין אנשים ולהביא לשיח אחר מכבד יותר גם במצבים של שונות גדולה ושל קונפליקט קשה. בטוחני שהתוכנית והמרכזים ימשיכו להתפתח בשנים הבאות ולהביא בשורה לחברה בארץ על כל גווניה. אני רוצה בהזדמנות זאת להודות קודם כל לכל אלה שנועה הזכירו, הרבות שלקחו חלק בתכנון היום ערב עיון הזה, וגם לצוות שלי, צוות נפלא, צוות נהדר שליווה אותנו דרך ארוכה, לכל השותפים הרבים שסייעו במשך כל השנים של התוכנית, לקדם את המשימה הזאת ולהביא אותנו עד הלום. ואני מאחל לכולנו ערב יום עיון פורה ומעניין. תודה רבה.
תודה רבה ברוך. אז אנחנו גאות לפתוח את הכנס עם אדם יקר ומיוחד, פרופסור ברוך בוש, מייסד הגישה הטרנספורמטיבית בגישור, יחד עם יוסף פולג'ר, לשיחה בנושא האם דיאלוג טרנספורמטיבי יכול ליצור קשרים אמיתיים בין קהילות. We are happy to open our seminar with Professor Robert Albert Baruch Bush, Professor of Mediation and Dispute Resolution at Hofstra University, New York School of Law. Professor Bush founded the transformative model of mediation with Joseph Folger. In this lecture, we will answer the question, can transformative dialogue create tangible connections between communities? A little note about questions. אנחנו מגדירים את כולם על מיוט, אתם לא יכולים להוציא את עצמכם ממיוט, אבל אם יש שאלות, אתם מוזמנים לכתוב אותם בצ'אט, אנחנו לא בטוחים שנספיק להתייחס להכל, אבל אנחנו מאוד נשתדל. Professor Bush, you have the floor.
Okay. Wow. It's a lot of people on Zoom. You got to go pages and pages and pages to find everybody. Okay, I will not try to make pleasantries because actually the time is quite limited, as I understand. So the first thing I need to do is get out of this chat room. But I would ask Batya or somebody, as you said you were going to post the PDF in the chat room. I don't see it there at the moment.
It will be there in a minute.
In a minute. Okay, great. So the question that, as I read it, and you know, there's always this thing of translating from English to Hebrew, Hebrew to English. Can you folks who are not English speakers, I think they're supposed to be subtitles, but I don't see them. Do you see them? Yes, they're there?
Yes, we see this.
Okay, excellent. So the title that the talk has, I'm actually retranslating the Hebrew a little bit. Okay, my translation is, can transformative dialogue form genuine connections? Kishurim amitim. Amitim, the way I read it, is genuine or true connections, as opposed to tangible. Sometimes the truest things are not the tangible. But in any event, that's how I translate it, between polarized communities. And I'm adding the word polarized in there because that really seems to be the issue today almost everywhere, is that we are looking for a way to transcend the polarizations that afflict us. So I'm going to share, hopefully, this screen with you, and this basically tracks the PDF file that you're going to get in a minute. Can everybody see that on there? There's the title as I've retranslated it. And the answer to that I give to this question is yes, a qualified yes. Yes, transformative dialogue can help to do this, provide that certain things are also true. And that's going to be the subject of what I'm going to talk about. Now, this first page, I have to give thanks to Professor Ravital, who actually developed this Hebrew translation for a conference that I gave an address at nearly 15 years ago at Bar-Ilan University. So this is sort of our overall diagram of conflict transformation, but I'm going to unpack that a little bit. Let me start out by saying this. I want to make about 3 or 4 points. First of all, the reason that I would say transformative dialogue, the transformative model as applied to dialogue, can achieve these genuine connections and do so better than any other model, because there are lots of dialogue models around today. You don't have to go very far to find one. But the transformative dialogue model is unique in several ways. And the first one is represented by this picture, which is our picture of conflict is not based upon an overarching theory like human needs theory, problem solving, needs and interests theory, or narrative theory. It's based upon an interactional picture of conflict. And the premise here is that the interaction between the parties matters to parties to conflict, whether they're individuals or groups, as much or more than anything else matters. Conflict is about interaction between me and you, between self and other, between one group and another group. And unfortunately, what happens, and I'm going to start unpacking this diagram, many times is that folks get caught in what we call the negative conflict cycle. So when conflict arises, no matter how coordinated and competent and sure of ourselves we are, we tend to get stricken with a sense of weakness. And there are some subcategories of that, or markers of that I've indicated there. I'm not going to go through all of them here. And simultaneously, we tend to close in on ourselves and become self-absorbed to the exclusion of even being aware of anybody else's presence. So we have the experience of weakness and self-absorption, a negative experience of self and a negative experience of other. That's what conflict generates for most of us when it occurs. And the result of that is that our interaction from this posture and stance of weakness and self-absorption becomes very quickly sometimes negative, destructive, alienating, and ultimately demonizing. And I'm sure that you are very well acquainted with those words and with those states of being. If you do mediation in a community mediation center, as I started out doing many, many years ago in 1976 in California, you see people walk into the room, I often tell my students, looking small and mean. That's how they look, shrunken into themselves and shooting daggers from their eyes at each other. And again, this is true whether we're talking about individuals or groups. That's negative conflict. Negative conflict puts people in a situation, in a state of smallness and meanness, weakness and self-absorption. And that's very dangerous. Alienating and demonizing are pretty negative states of experience, and they could lead to terrible things, as we see all too often, whether on the individual, interpersonal, or intergroup level. However, that's not the way things stay most of the time, thank God, because otherwise we would have killed each other, all of us, a long time ago. Instead, there are shifts happen. So I'm sort of stealing a line from Forrest Gump, that movie that you may have seen long ago, but I'm being a little bit more polite about it. Shifts happen. There is this phenomenon of social resiliency that we have in our human nature. And so we are able to bounce back, just as we do from illness, even, God forbid, COVID. Most of us who got it got better. Thank God. I didn't have too serious a case, but I got better. It wasn't so nice. Just as people bounce back from physical illness, they bounce back from social illness. And so people in conflict move back from weakness to strength. They move back from self-absorption to responsiveness to each other. And again, there's some markers of this. We get calmer, clearer, more confident, more decisive. That's all the movement back from weakness to strength. We get more attentive to each other, more open, more civil, more trusting and willing to accept each other and each other's good faith. That's the movement back to responsiveness. So overall, this takes us back to our overall diagram, and I may as well go back to the beginning here and this wonderful Hebrew diagram. Overall, the picture looks like this. There is if these empowerment and recognition shifts occur, the shift from weakness to strength and from self-absorption to responsiveness. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Hebrew words. I can read them, but I would be embarrassed to sound silly. But if these shifts take place, then the overall conflict cycles back from negative interaction to positive interaction, from negative to positive, destructive to constructive, alienating to connecting, and demonizing to humanizing. And the conflict interaction resumes a positive character. This can happen, and often does happen, whether or not there's any resolution. So our picture of conflict is not about resolution. It's not about resolving conflict. It's about changing the character of conflict interaction. And that's one thing that's unique about the transformative model of mediation and of dialogue. So our target, our aim, our goal is not resolution. It's changed interaction. Conflict, transformation. Transformation is a big word for change. Change in the conflict interaction. Now, point one, if that happens, there's a possibility for other things to happen. If that doesn't happen, that is to say, if conflict stays negative and destructive, alienating, demonizing, nothing else of real value is going to happen. Nothing of real value is going to happen. If there's resolution, it won't be particularly sustainable. Because when people have an interaction that is poisonous and toxic, any resolution or agreement that they make, you can't count on it lasting for very long. You count on it falling apart very soon. No relationship changes can last if there hasn't been a change in the interaction. We promise to do this and this for each other, but those promises fall by the wayside because the interaction between us is still on the negative side of this graph, of this diagram. And so the critical thing for us is changing the interaction itself. And then everything else becomes possible. Now, that leads to my second point. In our model, what is it that changes interaction from negative to positive? What actually makes that shift in the overall interaction? So here I have to go to another slide. By the way, again, I just want to stress, when we say change interaction, what's changed? What's the change? So look at some of the words. I struggle with these words all the time to find better ones. The change is from weak and selfish to strong and responsive. The interaction changes. That's the character of the new interaction, strong and responsive. From helpless and hostile to competent and considerate. I like to think of the H's to the C's. That's what changes. From anxious and reactive to calm and deliberate. From alienation, from self and other, from myself and from you, to agency, connection with self, and understanding, connection with you. So if I look at this set of descriptors, let me ask you, where would you rather be? On the left side of the page or the right side of the page? Obviously, we'd rather be on the right side of the page. You would, and so would I, and so would everybody. What people care about in conflict, and that's what our model says, is not just what they get at the end of the day, but how they act as they go through conflict together. I'm going to quote my father, Olav Shalom, which I always like to do, and he was the quote in our first book. My father used to say, the key to being a mensch, I'm sure we all understand that term, Hebrew or Yiddish, is stand up for yourself and make room for the other guy. Little did I know, when he said that the whole time I was growing up, that was going to be my theme song in transformative conflict theory. Stand up for yourself, strength, and make room for the other guy. That's Dave Bush. That's my father. It also happens to be my son. But my father said that, although I think my son does that too. So how do people make the switch to change the interaction? The key to helping parties achieve real change, real conflict transformation, is the parties themselves. Party self-determination. The exercise of party agency is what changes the interaction. I'm going to go back. I don't want to make your head spin, but I'm going to go back again to the diagram. Here's the diagram. The way this whole thing changes, begins to change, starts to change, is with the empowerment shift. The shift from weakness to strength. When people are stuck in weakness, when I feel weak, there's no chance I'm open up to you. There's no chance I'm really listening to you. I'm locked into myself because I'm locked into weakness. So the first thing that has to happen to change the overall interaction is the shift from weakness to strength, empowerment, the empowerment shift. How does that happen? So our belief is that it happens by having people make their own decisions, exercise their own capacity for agency. The way that you gain strength in weight training is not to have your coach pick up the weights for you. That doesn't add 1 ounce of muscle to your body. The same thing is, the way you become an excellent musician is you have to do the scales, not that your teacher does the scales and you listen. The same thing is for conflict. Parties gain strength, gain a sense of their own competence, their own capacity for handling life's challenges by making decisions. And every little decision they make adds to that sense of competence. So when people have begun to feel that they're falling apart, or they have fallen apart, the way that they pull themselves back together again, and that's the movement from weakness to strength, is by making decisions in the conflict process itself. That's how empowerment shifts occur. If that's the case, then, fast forward again, then the most important thing for an intervener, whether that intervener is a mediator or a dialogue facilitator, the intervener's role, principle, job is support and never supplant or force. Support party deliberation and decision making. Support and never force inter-party understanding. That's the key. When you do that, then the parties are always the ones who choose at every point, and every choice that they make adds to strength, adds to an empowerment shift, and then creates the situation where, feeling stronger, people can begin to open up to each other and make shifts in recognizing one another, in considering one another. So now shifting to transformative dialogue. This is all part of the theory of transformative conflict intervention, whatever kind of intervention it is. We developed this theory in relation to mediation, but it equally applies to dialogue. I hope I am not talking too fast for the translators. If I am, someone should slow me down. So in dialogue, in transformative dialogue, it is the parties who are choosing at every point in the process. As one of our dialogue experts puts it, and he's written about this, Eric Clevin, a political science and sociology professor in Vermont, as he puts it, the parties choose, and the question is for them, who do you want to talk to, about what, and how? Those are all your choices. They're not my choices as an intervener. My role is to, if you want, and the way he puts it, and our dialogue folks put it, is to co-create the process with the parties. But that doesn't mean taking decisions away from them. It means supporting their decisions about who to talk to, what to talk about, and how to talk about it. Now, there are some specifics that I can offer you in that regard. Here are some of the key supportive intervener responses in transformative dialogue. Number one, inquiring about dialogue. In other words, how do you start the process? You start the process by asking people first of all, getting to know people on a one-to-one basis. And as you get to know them, inquiring about whether they think dialogue would be useful in their community, but not pushing for it, not pushing them into dialogue, but instead allowing it to emerge. So the dialogue process in our model is an emergent process. It's not an NGO, as Eric describes he did long ago in the Balkans. It's not an NGO coming from outside of the country and showing up and finding people and choosing people from different constituencies, usually trying to make the numbers equal on both sides, whatever those sides are, whatever those identities are. The NGO identifies people and then brings them to a place and puts them, this is what Eric calls the abducted by aliens model, where people wind up, all of a sudden, they're having a dialogue with folks, and it's a terrific experience, and they enjoy it, and then they go back home to their neighborhoods, and no one else did it. And everybody is saying, wow, you seem pretty different. What happened to you? I was abducted by aliens. That's how dialogue processes often start. That's not how transformative dialogue starts. It starts by an emergent process through which people identify themselves as wanting this kind of conversation with others. In the new book that Eric is writing with another colleague, Judy Saul, there's a description of this in the state of Vermont, when people began to be interested in, I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock, when people began to be interested in overcoming the political divides that had arisen during the Trump years. And people weren't talking to each other. People were afraid of talking to each other. People were afraid of each other just like that. If you were afraid to put a sign in your front yard. So if people begin to identify for themselves, they want to talk to others. So that's how the constituency, the roster for the dialogue begins, from the bottom up. In fact, everything here is from the bottom up, from the parties, not from an intervener from the outside. Second thing, preparing the parties for dialogue, not assuming the process is obvious. Meaning what? Meaning that dialogue is like mediation, and maybe dialogue is even worse. Dialogue means many things to many people. Most people, as Eric puts it, when they show up for a dialogue, they're afraid to talk because they think that they have to be civil to each other. In other words, that's sort of a condition. That's a given in the definition of dialogue, civil conversation. In transformative dialogue, nobody says you have to be civil. You can get angry, you can scream, you can rant and rave, or not. That's your choice. So you choose who do you want to talk to, about what, and how. How includes you want to scream or you want to talk quietly. There are no preset ground rules. So the transformative facilitator has to explain to the people who are interested in dialogue that it may not be what they thought it was, and has to give them a heads up about what can go on, how it might work. Ultimately, of course, all of those things are up to them. They can choose to make it a rule that you don't scream at each other and call each other names. That's up to them. That's not a ground rule that's set in advance or a structure that's set in advance by the intervener. Because in the transformative model, it's always the party's choice. And again, why is it always the party's choice? Because that's what involves the exercise of agency, of decision-making. And decision-making and agency are the muscle of empowerment, of getting stronger, of bringing back strength. And bringing back strength is a precondition for everything else that happens in shifting from negative to positive conflict. So you see, there's a logic, there's a coherency to why we do what we do and how it works. We know how it works. We know why it works. Another point, the mediation always follows the party's agenda. The intervener is not leading the discussion, the dialogue. The intervener is not pushing the dialogue in any particular direction, not setting the agenda. It doesn't come in with a set agenda, which often dialogue facilitators do have an agenda. The agenda is to reach a resolution that meets the needs and interests of everybody in the room. No, that's not, an intervener doesn't make that agenda. If that's what the parties want to do, that's their agenda. But the intervener doesn't lead them to that or push them to that. He follows. A transformative intervener is a follower, not a leader. A supporter, not a decision maker. And then another intervention is reflection. Those of you who have learned or studied about transformative mediation will, or who have read our book, will recognize much of this. Reflection, not reframing and not questioning. Transformative interveners don't ask the parties a lot of questions. We're not probing to find out what their underlying interests are, because that's not our job. If they want to go to the question of interests, they will go there. And we can be supportive. How? By reflecting what they say. This is what you seem to be interested in. This is what seems to be driving you as I hear you. Is that right? And that question is also not a question. It's what we call a check-in. We don't reframe what the parties say. If the parties are putting things in a very negative way, that's their choice. They don't have to put things in a positive way. They don't have to look at the glass as half full. They look at the glass any way they want to. And our job is to reflect the way they look at the glass. Why is that valuable? Because when people hear a reflection of what they've said, it allows them to think about whether that really is what they want to say, or whether they want to say it differently, or whether they want to add to it or take away from it. Every single one of those things is a decision. And every time people make decisions, they get stronger and stronger and stronger. And conflict interaction begins to change from negative to positive. Summarizing is another intervention, but summarizing does not mean prioritizing. It doesn't mean putting the issues in an order, as it seems from the intervener's point of view. What's more important, what's less important? I have no view of that. I am trying to accurately reflect what the parties talk about and especially what they disagree about. And I'm also not trying to edit it out and make it sound prettier. I'm not trying to tamp down disagreement. I'm trying to highlight disagreement, because that's what's going on. I support their choices by highlighting their conversation, amplifying it, not toning it down. And checking in, I check in. This is the only kind of question I ask. I check in, is this what you mean to say? Is this what you want to talk about? Now that you've talked about these three things, what do you want to talk about next? Those are questions, but those are what we call check-ins. They're not substantive, probing questions. And finally, transformative facilitators stay the hell out of the way. They let parties talk directly, even if it's chaotic, even if it's disorderly, even if it's quote-unquote scary. We're not going to be scared. Why not? Because we believe in the parties. We believe in their good intentions, and we believe in their good capacities for choice, for strength, and for consideration of each other. And therefore, we don't have to stifle what they say. We stay out of the way. We don't stifle. Every single one of these responses, of these intervener responses, increases party choice, and therefore party strength, and therefore parties' sense of their own agency, their own self in the conflict. And that initiates conflict transformation. That's the initial step in any move towards changing conflict from negative to positive. If I don't do these things, if I do the opposites, and I can definitely imagine the opposite to every one of these, directive moves to the exact opposite. When interveners use directive moves, I'm going to go back again to the very beginning. When interveners use directive moves, interventions, the effect of those is to send people back from strength to weakness, to infantilize people, to remove their strength, to remove their choice, to remove their sense of their own agency. How can that possibly help to change conflict transformation, to change conflict interaction? The answer is it can't. It's going to reinforce weakness, self-absorption, and negative and destructive conflict. So that's a problem. And just as lots of mediation practices are counterproductive in that sense, they reinforce weakness and selfishness and don't create movement towards strength and consideration and concern. A lot of dialogue models include processes that do the same thing. So our model has these particular, I said, can transformative dialogue work to form genuine connections between polarized groups? Yes, it can. If it follows this format, if it works this way. That's how it's designed. What effect does that have? Last points. What effect does that have? What impacts does that have? We believe that the impacts are, number one, it not only moves interaction into positive territory, but it moves it into sustainable positive territory. It lays a foundation for ongoing positive interaction. I think I'm still within my time, am I? Just about over. It forms a basis for strong and connected deliberation and decision making by the parties themselves about what they want to do. And therefore, if it leads to resolutions, those resolutions are sustainable resolutions. There's no such thing as a sustainable resolution that is made, an agreement that is made by parties who are still carrying the baggage and the burden of toxic, negative, destructive conflict. Any resolution that's made is not worth the paper it's written on. It's founded on sand, and it'll fall apart. Why? Because it's not based upon a positive interaction between the parties. However, another impact can be not a resolution at all, a disagreement, an ongoing disagreement, but with understanding. Disagreement with understanding is often the result of dialogue, not an agreement of any kind. An agreement to disagree, if you want to call it that, it's what we call living with no. The world has been obsessed since 1980, when it was published. How many years is that? 40 years? With getting to yes. In the world we live in, often getting to yes is not a realistic possibility. Living with no is almost always a realistic possibility. And therefore, that's another impact. Transformative dialogue either will lead to sustainable resolution, or it will lead to ongoing disagreement, but with greater understanding. It'll either lead to real getting to yes, or real living with no. We also believe that the result of this kind of dialogue process will be increased individual and group efficacy. People will get better at not just dealing with conflict, but at participation in social and public affairs. If you want to call it that, there's something called social capital. Transformative dialogue increases social capital. It increases pro-social interaction. That's a tremendously important thing outside of the world of conflict. Are people willing to participate in their local communities? Are people willing to serve on school boards? Are people willing to interact with their fellow citizens, or they just want to stay at home and surf the computer? Well, the dialogue process can increase an individual's willingness to get involved and to get involved effectively, increased efficacy. And finally, if it's not obvious, this will tend to reduce polarization. Can we achieve reduced polarization? Can there be genuine connections between polarized communities? We think there can. We think there can. And we think that we are beginning to see it. And the transformative dialogue process can help. Okay, I've made a lot of strong claims there. If you ask me where's my body of evidence, then I'm going to start to fump and say ba 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 ba, because we're still collecting it. but this is what we believe are the possibilities. So, I don't know, I haven't been interrupted with questions. Now I'm supposed to have time for questions, I guess, if you have any. Otherwise, I could probably keep talking. I usually do that.
Okay, so there is they're asking here if you can give us the example of the coffee cups, if you can tell us more about that.
Okay, so let me back up. The coffee cups example is about the first step here. At least it's a good example of that. Inquiring about whether people want to be involved in dialogue, not pushing, but allowing it to emerge. So Jody Miller, Jody is supposed to be on this call. Are you here, Jody, somewhere? I thought she was. Maybe she didn't have, maybe she got called into me. Jody is the the head of the Human Rights Commission in Dutchess County. And you there, Jody? Hello? Okay.
Jody, you can now open your mic if you want to. We've made you co-host.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everybody. Hello.
That's Jody Miller. Jody Miller, you want to say a couple of words about 100 Cups of Coffee?
Sure. The 100 Cups of Coffee, Transformative Dialogue Project. We started in Poughkeepsie, New York. The project has taken place across the entire city, engaging people from elected officials, community members, school members, nonprofits, and really organizing it around topics that people wanted to talk about. And then whoever wanted to talk about that topic would show up. And we would often get a really great, diverse group of people from different sectors of the city. And sometimes people from outside of the city who heard about the topic and wanted to talk about that. And then people would also decide that they wanted to convene their own 100 cups of coffee around a topic they were interested in. And so we would...
Why do we call it 100 Cups of Coffee?
Because it often takes a lot of coming together over coffee and tea or a beverage to promote positive interaction. So how much you get together, and people just love to come together, grab a cup of coffee or tea and sit down and start talking to each other. So it really drew people in.
Another meaning of that is when Jody's colleague Eric Clevin, Jody, Eric, and Judy Saul are sort of our transformative dialogue team, or at least prominent members of it. Eric started doing this maybe 15 years ago in the Balkans, in the period after the war in Serbia Herzegovina, and he came and went to cafes, again getting to know people, hung out in cafes and would talk to people and get to know them, and would have 1 cup of coffee, 2 cups, 3 cups, 4 cups, and sometime during that coffee cup process he might bring up the idea of dialogue and see how they responded to it and whether they were interested in it. And some were and some weren't. And when people were, he would ask them, well, who do you think you want to talk to? And what do you want to talk about? Hence the idea of who wants to talk to whom about what. And to answer those questions before the dialogue starts, right? For the group to emerge, it takes 100 cups of coffee. So that was his original use of that phrase. Does that answer your question? By the way, Jody, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the topics that people have brought up in the 100 Cups project in Dutchess County involve things like lighting, community lighting. There are people who want more lights on the street, and there are people who want less lights. I don't like lights in my window. I don't like criminals on my streets. What's the matter with you? What's the matter with you? That was an example of a pretty charged dialogue topic at some point along the way. Do I remember that right, Jody?
Yeah, people wanted to talk about lighting in the city and how just even turning on porch lights could make a welcoming street more welcoming community. And that actually snowballed into discussing how we could get more lights onto streets where children were walking home from school and it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, and not just talking about it, but actually having people who could do things about it, including the electric company that has programs that supply lights, a architecture firm that works with cities to do things like this. So people and organizations that could actually take these steps to get things done were also involved. And I think that's the beauty of transformative dialogue, and particularly with this project, is it brings people in who can then take actions if that's what they decide to do.
Sometimes it doesn't always happen completely without some sort of intervener positive action. Jody happens to be in a sort of visible position in the community as the head of the I always get the name wrong, Jody, the Human Rights Council, right?
Close.
Close.
Human Rights Commission.
Human Rights Commission, okay. And so she is like a beacon, right? So when people are having trouble, they reach out, they cry help, as you put it the other day when we talked about this, and come to a person who they think might be able to help. Now that person can now begin to intervene in a top-down fashion. Okay, I'm going to call these people, bring them together, or that person can explore the dialogue possibility, allowing it to emerge, but not pushing it and not forcing it down people's throats. I'm wondering if you want to say a couple of things. Do we have other questions before I take up all the time on this?
Yeah, we do actually.
Oh,
so the first question is, so the first question is, how do you take cultural considerations into account?
How do you take what?
Cultural considerations into account.
Cultural considerations, okay. And I don't know if someone wants to say more about what they mean by that. But when you are, if I'm an intervener or if I'm a mediator and I'm following a transformative model, I am not bringing any stuff of mine into that conversation. Everything I'm doing is supporting what parties want to do. So they are defining the scope and the method and the tone of the conversation for themselves. If their cultural orientation has impacts on that, so we don't like to see people face to face. Okay, good. Not necessary. That's your choice. We can't deal with screaming. Okay, that's your choice. We don't like whatever it is, or we do like screaming. I have participated in many mediations where the culture was a screaming culture. I'm not going to make any comments about Israel right now based on my visit 15 years ago, but I lived in Italy for a while, and I'll tell you, they do a lot of screaming over there. So I once mediated a case with a student of mine in which the parties spent most of the time screaming at each other in terms and in tone that scared the hell out of me. My student was unbelievable. She sat there and she just, reflected what they said and she supported what they said. That's what she's supposed to do. So cultural orientation is automatically in this model given its due consideration. The parties choose how they want to do it. By the way, if they're from two different cultures, and they may well be, and those cultures have different approaches to conflict, then that's going to be a subject of the dialogue, isn't it? That's going to be something they need to talk about, I guess, if they want to. I'm not forcing them to. So that's, I guess, an answer to that. Okay. Another one, Bashar?
Yeah, and going back to the screaming a little bit, there was a heated debate in the chat about if people are screaming, if that can allow an effective dialogue. So if you can elaborate more on that.
Sure. Can I elaborate more on that? So you know what? I'm gonna stop this share at this point so I can see what's going on. I see there's a whole bunch of stuff in the chat that I haven't seen. One of the things that the sort of external demand for civility does, which prevents screaming from the outside, tamps it down is that it stops people from saying what they need to say. Sometimes people need to scream, and they need to scream for themselves as well as for the other people who are listening to them. So if people are screaming, if they're choosing to express themselves in that way, why would I want to stop it? But if they're screaming, how can anything useful occur? The answer is a lot of useful things can occur. One thing that can occur is that the screamer can finally say what he wants to say, the way he wants to say it, without someone telling him, no, you can't say that. That's a major increase in party choice and in agency. Now, the screaming may or may not have positive effects on the other people in the room, but that's independent of the effect on party agency. So to tell people how they can talk, we have a concept called voice. The U.S. Postal Service, which used our transformative model, had a slogan, voice and choice, or choice and voice. I remember when Hillary Clinton was running for president and her primary campaign was not going very well, then at a certain point she spoke in Vermont, and when she finished that speech, she came out and she said, I found my voice. In other words, I told my handlers to shut up, and I said what I wanted to say the way I wanted to say it. Finding your voice is an incredibly important aspect of exercising, discovering and exercising your own agency. There's a film that came out a couple of years ago about King George of England. It's called The King's Voice. I'm sure some of you have seen this film. It's an incredibly powerful film. And the critical moment in is when the king realizes he has a voice. That's his line. I have a voice. You bet your life. Everybody has a voice. To tell people how to express themselves is a major disempowerment. So screaming in the room is not the worst thing in the world that can happen. The worst thing in the world is if you stop people from expressing themselves the way they want to. Can good things happen if there's so much chaos and screaming in the room? Yeah, sure. Most conversation that takes place between people in this world does not conduct itself in an orderly way. When was the last time you had an orderly conversation with your friends about a topic that you disagreed about? Probably never. So what? You still talked. You're still friends. And they understand you better. And you understand them better. All right, enough.
Okay.
Another question?
Thank you. Yeah. Leon asks, if we reflect and not reframe a party's offensive speech, would the other party not lose confidence in our neutrality?
Never. Not if you do with everybody the same way. It's called multi-partiality. I support everybody in the exact same way as everybody else. Even lawyers understand it. It's called equal protection under the law, right? No, I don't get suspicious of you when you reflect. I know that you're not agreeing with him. You're just helping him to say what he wants to say. I need you to do the same thing for me. As long as you do the same thing for me, I don't have any doubts about your siding with the other party. That's the short answer. I'm not good at short answers, but that's the short answer.
Okay.
I've never heard people object to this, by the way. Another one?
Maybe we have time for another short question. Ronnie asks if naturally dialogue attracts more older people, and if so, how do we encourage younger people to take part in it?
That's a good question. I don't know is the answer to that question. I don't think I have lots of evidence on that point. I'm not sure if Jody wants to comment on that from her experience with the Cups of Coffee project. Jody, you have something you can tell us about that?
We didn't have any dialogues that I can with younger people. I think the same premise though would apply. So you would ask, who do they want? What do they want to talk about? I mean, people are talking about a lot of different things. So what do they want to talk about, and who would they like to have that conversation with? They might want to have it. The other thing about dialogue in the transformative approach is that we look at intra-party. So you might want to talk to your own group about that thing. right? And figure out what you want to do or what you think about it, and whether you want to talk to the other group at all. We don't privilege intergroup dialogue over intragroup. We see those two things as important, as the same importance. So, you know, if you're talking about youth or younger people, what are they talking about, and what are they, do they want to have a conversation with each other or with other people? Who do they want to talk to about that thing?
As we're talking, and I'm just going to finish up with this, we published something called the Transformative Mediation Source Book about 10 years ago. It has some real interesting stuff in it. One chapter was written by a fellow from Sweden. And although I'm not sure that he specifically detailed this project in there, but one of the interventions that he was involved in was a dialogue between young folks and old folks and some city officials about a skateboard park. This was a very, very controversial thing because the city didn't think it was a skateboard park. They thought it was a park where people could go and sit and have a cup of coffee. Speaking of cups of coffee, and the old people would go there, and then all of a sudden the kids took it over and it became a skateboard park. And it was unusable by anybody else when they were skateboarding. So it was a very, very, and there were incidents that occurred and accidents that occurred. It was a very controversial thing in a major city in Sweden. And the people involved eventually came into a dialogue process where there was a long discussion about what to do with that park. And I don't remember the outcome, but there's an example. So what I would say about that is, are young people going to get involved? It depends. Are they interested in talking? Who do they want to talk to? About what and how? Same question applies. Who do you want to talk to? About what and how? That's where Jody and Eric and Judy always start, and that brings them to an emergent dialogue with the people that identify themselves as the participants in that dialogue. Okay, well, I'm sure there's much more to talk about here. I just want to say that in order to do this, you have to have a foundation, at least somewhat of a foundation, in transformative mediation practice. And I know some of you do. And I know others of you don't. And I don't think that any of our folks have been over to Israel for quite a while teaching that subject in Israel. And if there's interest in that, and if that's one of the things that comes out of this dialogue, that's certainly something that we could talk further about. So I'm just opening that up for whoever is interested. Thank you very much for your interest and attention, and I hope that I haven't been talking too fast for the translators to keep up, and if I have, I'm sorry, translators, and if I haven't, I thank you for keeping up with me.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations on this wonderful conference.
Thank you so much, Professor Bush, for your fascinating lecture, and thank you, Jody, for your input. תודה רבה לפרופסור בוש על ההרצאה המרתקת. There are definitely more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we are out of time. אנחנו מחכים להמשך למידה משותפת. כעת נתפזר להרצאות ברחבי העולם. אתם יכולים לראות את התוכניה כאן. בעוד דקה תוכלו לבחור לבד, על ידי לחיצת כפתור, לאיזו הרצאה תרצו להיכנס. כדי להיכנס לחדרים, חפשו את האייקון של הריבועים. אם אתם במחשב, מצד ימין למטה, אם אתם בטלפון, מצד שמאל למעלה, ולחצו join ליד כותרת החדר אליו תרצו להצטרף. אנא בחרו וייכנסו לחדר וקחו 5 דקות הפסקה. ההרצאות יתחילו בשעה 6:10 בדיוק. במידה ואתם מתקשים, אנחנו נמצאים כאן במליאה לענות על שאלות.
If you send me a list of the questions in the chat, I will do my best to respond to them and send those responses to one of the Mosaica folks.
Great.
To the questions we didn't get to.
We will do that. Thank you very much.